Welcome to this week's narrative video. This week I've chosen to focus on the apps are dying narrative. That hasn't been in the news quite as much as some other things that have been this week. Obviously Samsung had a big event and there are a number of other things in the news. But there were three stories today, Wednesday, which do play into this narrative and which actually mostly refute this narrative. And that's my overall take on this narrative. So that's what I'll be talking about today. The way in which there's this prevailing narrative about apps dying, and in reality things are very different from that. Apps are actually thriving and arguably growing as fast as they ever have. And some of the perceived threats to apps dying or perceived alternatives to apps seem to be struggling, even as apps themselves continue to do very well. So I'll talk through those three stories from today because they're each relevant to this discussion. The first of those stories is some analysis from App Annie, which was reported by TechCrunch, and that's the article that I linked to on the site today, which shows, well, the headline is that the various Android app stores altogether are going to add up to a higher number in terms of total revenues by the end of this year than the Apple App Store. That's something of a milestone. The Apple App Store has always been well ahead of the Google Play Store specifically, but you rarely see analysis that really takes into account those other stores for Android apps, and those are particularly important in markets like China, where the Play Store basically doesn't exist. But they're relevant elsewhere as well. And so interesting analysis from App Annie that includes those other app stores and argues that in totality those Android app stores will actually generate more revenue than the official iOS app store this year. But the biggest story in the context of this particular narrative is the rate of growth. And App Annie has compound annual growth rates for those two markets in its forecast for the next 5 years. And they are sort of 18–19% per year. So I'm just going to look at the numbers here quickly. It looks like the mobile app forecast for annual downloads are going to go from 149 billion in 2016 to 197, so very nearly 200 billion in 2017. So that's growth of almost a third. From the revenue perspective, the combined app stores are going to grow from 61.8 billion in 2016 to 82.2 billion. So again, growth of about a third year on year. And they're projecting, an 18% CAGR in revenue, 19% CAGR in terms of actual downloads. And so both those sets of numbers really indicate that apps are far from dying. They're growing very rapidly still, even as, and this is an important point, even as smartphones are reaching saturation point in mature markets. In most mature markets, smartphone penetration as a percentage of overall mobile penetration is probably 90+%. In the US, it's getting to 95%. There aren't that many new smartphone customers in these markets, and most of the new smartphone customers in the world are in emerging markets, not in mature markets. And in those emerging markets, of course, they're likely to spend far less. The advertising revenue, even if they're not paid apps there, the ad revenue from ad-based apps is going to be much lower per user there, and yet we're still seeing both that massive growth in annual downloads and in annual revenue, which is remarkable, and it suggests that the number of apps downloaded per person, the amount of money per person is continuing to grow, even as I say, we have this prevailing narrative about apps dying. So where does this narrative come from? Well, it's mostly been about alternatives or perceived alternatives to the app model, and one of the ones that really did the rounds just under a year ago, quite a bit, and was sort of a big part of this narrative, was chatbots. And the idea that bots within, say, messaging applications and other similar environments would somehow take over the functions that had been provided by apps, would do it better, and therefore would start to supplant apps as the main way of interacting with certain services, with certain companies, and so on. And so we saw Facebook and Microsoft at their big developer events in the first half of last year, both touting a vision around AI chatbots, and communications as a platform was the phrase that Microsoft used at that point. Facebook had its own version of that, which was focused on Messenger. Microsoft was both building a platform for apps within Skype at the time, but also building tools for developers to build their own bots that could run elsewhere. And so they were building those tools. And yet in the past year, we've really seen very little actually pan out by way of these chatbots and their impact on the market. And in fact, the two stories that I shared today indicate that Microsoft and Facebook are taking rather different approaches to this. Facebook really seems to have backed off quite a bit its original vision that it shared at its F8 developer conference last year. That was all about chatbots, AI, and so on. At the time, they were also working on this M virtual assistant that existed within Messenger, which has never opened up to the public as a whole. It was made available to quite a few journalists last year who wrote somewhat enthusiastically about it. But it was very clear at the time that although M was supposed to be an AI-based assistant, it was also relying very heavily on human beings for ostensibly training at the time. But in reality, for basically everything that it was doing, it was relying very heavily on human beings, and it never seems to have evolved beyond that point. And their vision for M has now evolved where it's no longer kind of what it was, and it's mostly going to insert itself into people's conversations and offer to help with various basic tasks now, rather than the wider set of tasks that were originally supposed to carry out for users. Today's story from Facebook was about a new approach to group bots that's supposed to be announced at F8 this year. And this is really about bots inserting themselves into group conversations for things like sports scores or progress on, say, a food order, a delivery order, or whatever. And these won't be interactive AI bots. These will simply be automated delivery of notifications about progress in some kind of process or score changes in a sporting match, for example. So it's going to be very much more basic, very much less AI, frankly. Much more useful, though, at the same time. And I think that's been the interesting thing about Facebook's vision. Is as it's evolved, the vision of what it's expecting bots to do has become more realistic, less ambitious, but I think as a result actually more compelling as well. And so you've got a lot more buttons and user interface elements, which is really the way bots have worked in, say, China, where they've become very popular, rather than the very basic text-based interactions that Facebook started out promising us last year. Microsoft, on the other hand, seems to have somewhat stuck with its original vision, and it had this disastrous launch for an AI bot that it called Tay last year, which very quickly learned from the people who were interacting with it to be pretty obnoxious, to use racial epithets and various other things, and quickly had to be taken down. But kudos to Microsoft, they didn't give up on that area, and they've launched 2 more chatbots since then, one in China and one that was announced today, and that was the news item I covered today, in India. And it's English speaking, but obviously Indian English is different from, say, American English, and there's different accents, there are different mannerisms and sort of unique phrases and words and so on that are used in Indian English relative to, say, American English or British English, which is what I speak a mix of those two, having come from the UK originally. So it's been quite ambitious still in terms of the sort of chatbots that it's trying to develop. But both these companies continue to pursue these strategies in very different ways. As I say, they started out very similar, but have sort of diverged since then. And it sounds like we'll see Facebook's strategy continue to evolve at F8 in a couple of weeks. But the point here is neither of these companies has really delivered on its original vision. We're not all suddenly using bots to do the things that apps used to do for us. And so bots, which had been pitched as one of these big threats to apps, really haven't become that thing. They haven't really dented the uptake of apps. And that was pretty predictable. In fact, I predicted it in a piece that I wrote for TechPinions about a year ago about the limits to bots. There are certain scenarios in which bots work really well, but they're mostly about ones where interactions are very simple, where the number of options available are very limited, where the possible range of responses to a question is very limited. And even then, it tends to be most useful for interactions you don't expect to repeat. If you expect to repeat an interaction, you probably download the app and automate it and make it a lot easier for yourself. So they're just very limited in terms of what they can do. So they're really not a big threat to apps. But the bigger issue with apps and the threat to apps is apps are dominated by games, and games are not replaceable by bots, except in very narrow circumstances. Trivia games maybe, but the vast majority of the games that generate revenue and that people actually use from the app stores are not replaceable by bots or really by any of the other alternatives to apps that have been posited. And as long as that remains the case, apps are very safe. Now, there are challenges with the in-app purchase model that drives most game revenue today. It drives the vast majority of game revenue, and it certainly shares some characteristics with gambling and other addictive behaviors which are pretty undesirable. And I've questioned in the past how sustainable that model is over the long term. But for now, it's the model that drives almost all game revenue in the app stores, and games in turn drive most of the revenue in the app stores overall. So as long as that remains the case, this trend of growing app downloads, the trend of growing app revenue will continue pretty much unabated, and that's likely to continue to be the case for some time to come. There are, of course, other app categories, and a lot of those apps are free to download and then monetized through subscriptions, and so Netflix would be a great example of that. But you can now buy a Netflix subscription through, say, the iOS App Store. And we're going to see more and more of this kind of thing as well, where subscriptions to content and other services are going to be purchased through the App Store model. And that's actually going to give the App Store another boost. That's likely a part of Apple's strategy for doubling their services revenue over the next few years is more and more of this subscription stuff, whether that's third-party applications like Netflix and Hulu and the MLB At-Bat app, or whether it's their own services that they're going to build around music and then increasingly probably around video and other areas as well. So the fact is, apps are here to stay. They're really not under threat from anything right now. They are clearly evolving though, and we're starting to see some of that really play out across the board. Apple's done a lot with this, with 3D Touch, with interactive notifications and so on. The latest version of Android further evolves the way notifications work and makes slightly more sophisticated the way that you can control which notifications you see. You can snooze notifications and so on. So we're seeing again this evolution of the way that apps work and some of their features. Samsung's event earlier today, Bixby, their new assistant, although they prefer to call it an interface, does have assistant capabilities, and one of them is context awareness within apps, such that when you invoke Bixby within the context of an app, it can take that context into account and share it to reminders or messaging or whatever. And we've seen that from Apple as well last year. So these apps are becoming more sophisticated. So apps are certainly evolving. They're not remaining static, but that's a way in which they are staying alive and continue to be very relevant to us. And so we're going to continue to see that evolution of applications becoming more sophisticated, having more extensions into other applications, into other parts of operating systems and so on. And because of that, they're going to stay very healthy as an ecosystem, and they're going to continue to be very successful. So that's the apps are dying narrative, which is one of those narratives that I frame in the way that is the prevailing narrative, but which I think in this case we can almost completely debunk. Apps are certainly not dying. They are evolving, but most of the things that were supposed to kill them off, notably chatbots, simply aren't panning out in the way that many people thought they would. And that's probably a good thing on balance. I think apps are serving us very well at this point. Just a quick note to wrap up this video. I should have said this at the beginning, but I'll say it now instead. I'm in a hotel room in New York City, which is why the background looks a little different from my last video. Hopefully there's not too much of a mess here in the background. I kind of dumped my stuff on the bed as I came in, but I'm traveling, but I hope to do these videos every week regardless of whether I'm traveling or not. So hopefully you've enjoyed this and found it useful. I'll keep doing these every week and highlighting a different narrative every week. Please provide feedback via email, via Twitter, via the website. I'd love to hear from you, hear what you would find useful, how we can improve these videos and make them more useful for you. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll be with you again next week.